Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Momma Murdered A Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Momma Murdered A Podcast, we're going to be going pretty deep into a super controversial case. The case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. This case is super well known and super controversial, in more ways than one. Gypsy Rose Blanchard murdered her own mom with a boyfriend that she'd met online. Some people say that Gypsy's actions can kind of be justified by the way that she was forced to live, while other people think that she's nothing more than a cold-blooded, monstrous murderer. I feel like this case needs no more introduction than that, so without further ado, let's get it. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born sometime in July of 1991, which isn't normally how this works. Normally, if we aren't sure about anything else in the case, then we're at least sure about the dates of birth of the people in the cases when I cover them. But Gypsy's actual birthday was changed over and over and over again throughout the years for various different reasons, and I'm not even 100% sure that she was even born in July of 1991. That's just the only month that I ever saw listed. Even when the date changes, the month is always listed as July, and the year is always listed as 1991. So I'm making an educated guess and saying that she was born sometime in July of 1991. Gypsy was born to her mom, Claudine, who everybody just called Dee Dee, so that's what we're going to call her for the remainder of this episode, and her dad, Rod. Rod was only 17 at the time that Gypsy was born, and Dee Dee was a little bit older at the age of 23 when she gave birth to baby Gypsy. They decided on the name Gypsy Rose for their newborn because Dee Dee liked the name Gypsy, and Gypsy's middle name, Rose, actually came from Rod's love of the band Guns N' Roses, which I thought was pretty cool. Dee Dee and Rod got married before Gypsy was even born, and they also separated and divorced before Gypsy was born. Gypsy's dad, Rod, left Dee Dee 3 months after they'd gotten married, and Rod later says that they separated and kind of decided to go their separate ways and try to co-parent because he realized that he had married Dee Dee for all the wrong reasons. Rod also says that the way that he was raised was if you get a woman pregnant, then you marry her, like there really wasn't another option. So that's what he did. But he soon realized that he was never going to be happy with Dee Dee, so he left. But he was super devoted to trying to be a good dad to Gypsy. Dee Dee moved in with her family in Louisiana after she and Rod split up. And Dee Dee and Gypsy lived with Dee Dee's parents, and it's been speculated that Dee Dee would steal, pretty small items, just petty theft kind of stuff. But she would only do this when she was, kind of pouting or not getting her way about something. Dee Dee was also super notorious for writing bad checks. Keep those little nuggets stored away in your memory bank for later. And Dee Dee tried over and over again to get Rod to come back, but Rod was 17 and he knew that he didn't want to be with Dee Dee, so it was after the two split up that Dee Dee got a job working as a CNA or a nurse's aide. But soon after this, Dee Dee's mom passed away. And normally I would have left that tidbit of information out, but I said all that to say this. There are quite a few different people within Dee Dee's family that were suspicious about whether or not Dee Dee had something to do with her own mom's death. People wonder about if Dee Dee was giving her mom the right meds, or they kind of even wonder if Dee Dee was feeding her mom or not. Dee Dee's mom had been pretty strict with Dee Dee about food intake when she was young, so people almost wonder if this was some kind of revenge starvation on Dee Dee's mom. So another little nugget to keep in your memory bank for later. All this is important, I promise. After Dee Dee's mom passed away in 1997, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived with Dee Dee's dad and her stepmom, and still to this day, both Dee Dee's stepdad and her stepmom, and a lot of Dee Dee's other family members are convinced that Dee Dee was trying to kill her stepmom by putting Roundup, weed and grass killer in her food. And if I'm not mistaken, she was actually caught putting the Roundup in her stepmom's food at one point or another. The way Dee Dee's family talks about it now is they absolutely knew that Dee Dee was putting Roundup, weed and grass killer in her food. But Dee Dee and Gypsy would eventually move out and get their own place in Louisiana. And then magically, after Dee Dee was out of the house with her stepmom and dad, her stepmom was all of a sudden perfectly fine again. And not sick at all. That's weird. So when Gypsy was born, she was perfect. She was a little premature, but other than that, she was completely healthy, a completely normal baby, which is also important to note for later. But when Gypsy was about 3 months old, Dee Dee had taken Gypsy into the ER to have her checked for sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is when you stop breathing in your sleep, and it also causes people to snore a lot more than people who don't have sleep apnea. But after everything was said and done, and Gypsy had been checked out, none of the medical professionals thought that Gypsy was suffering from sleep apnea. But sleep apnea can be kind of hard to diagnose because it doesn't have to happen every time you fall asleep for you to have sleep apnea. So even after being told that Gypsy did not have sleep apnea, Dee Dee just kept taking her back to the hospital and saying that she was sure that she did have sleep apnea. And I can kind of see this part, maybe just a little bit. Dee Dee was young, she was a first-time mom, and when I had my first son, I thought that everything in the world was wrong with him at any given time. You just over-worry yourself as a first-time mom, and I feel like that's normal. I feel like most moms go through that. But this was a lot more than that. This was different from just the normal paranoia of being a first-time mom. Dee Dee just kept taking Gypsy back over and over and over again to these different doctors and hospitals. And every time they would go see a different doctor, Dee Dee would give these doctors a whole list of symptoms that Gypsy, has that would all be symptoms of somebody suffering from sleep apnea. So eventually, doctors started keeping Gypsy overnight and kind of running test after test on her to try to see if they could find anything that pointed to a 3-month-old having sleep apnea. And I feel like they did this kind of because Dee Dee was giving them this whole list of symptoms and because she does have a medical background. It's not like she's just talking out of her ass and has no idea what she's talking about. And inevitably, Dee Dee did get a breathing machine for Gypsy. And I'm not actually sure if the hospital or a doctor gave Dee Dee this breathing machine, or if Dee Dee was just able to get her hands on one since she worked as a nurse's aide. But either way, Dee Dee now had this breathing machine and she's convinced that Gypsy has sleep apnea. Which I feel like a breathing machine is a pretty normal treatment for a lot of infants. Like, there are plenty of infants who use breathing machines for various different reasons, like upper respiratory infections or things like that. But as we'll soon figure out, Gypsy did not need this breathing machine. And this would only be the beginning of the laundry list of things that Dee Dee would later claim that Gypsy had. And once Dee Dee's family started to question if Gypsy was really suffering from anything at all, Dee Dee moved herself and Gypsy out of her family's home, which should have been a red flag if I'm throwing my 2 cents in, and I am. And it wasn't long after this that Dee Dee took Gypsy to the doctor again to inform them that Gypsy had also started having seizures in her sleep. And of course, nobody would assume that a mother is lying about her infant having seizures. Seizures are super scary to witness, and most parents just wouldn't make something like that up. But something to take note of here, as far as the sleep apnea goes, no one would have been around Gypsy when she was asleep besides Dee Dee. And as far as the claim of Gypsy having seizures in her sleep, again, no one would really be around besides Dee Dee to witness these seizures most likely. So these are all really small claims that doctors couldn't really be able to definitively say, yes, she's having seizures, or no, she's not having seizures. I mean, they could, but who's really questioning a mom that's saying these things about an infant? Nobody would question that normally, and normally you wouldn't think that you would need to question it about something that serious. Seizures can be super dangerous, and Gypsy's still this tiny, tiny baby when the seizure claims are made. But then over the next few years, Dee Dee would also claim that Gypsy was suffering from hearing and vision impairment, asthma, some kind of unknown chromosomal disorder, mild retardation, which is what Dee Dee called it. I'm only relaying the term that she used, and that's not even all that Dee Dee said that Gypsy was suffering from. She also claimed that Gypsy suffered from muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and even leukemia. So basically, every medical diagnosis in the book is what Gypsy had. Now, some of these diagnoses would come when Gypsy was way older, because eventually all of these diagnoses and more that I probably missed would eventually all come to fruition. Another thing that Dee Dee would later say about Gypsy was that she would never develop the mental capacity of anything more than a 6 or 7-year-old kid. And because Dee Dee was unfortunately pretty smart, and she had the wherewithal to think ahead as far as some of these disorders and diseases go, especially for the unknown chromosomal disorder. Because over time, the chromosome disorder would start breaking down all of Gypsy's bodily functions, and she'd need this chromosome disorder to make some of her bigger and more elaborate plans sound more legit later on. We're getting there. So Dee Dee tells Rod that, with this disease and this disorder and this syndrome, that Gypsy isn't expected to make it past the age of 18. This had to be hard to hear and even hard to think about. So when Gypsy was still a pretty young kid is when Dee Dee would take Gypsy to the doctor's offices or hospitals with newfound symptoms. And Dee Dee would always kind of refer back to the breathing machine like, see, she has sleep apnea. See, she suffers from epilepsy, so maybe she has X, Y, and Z too. And sadly, it usually worked. Gypsy would have surgeries done on her eardrums due to her supposed hearing impairment. She would also have a written prescription for glasses for her vision impairment. Gypsy would also undergo a few surgeries for the vision impairment. And these procedures and surgeries didn't stop there, though. Gypsy would also later have a biopsy done for her muscle tissue when the doctors were checking to see if Gypsy should be diagnosed with muscular dystrophy or not. And this biopsy test would be extremely painful, and Gypsy says that she still has the scar today, and none of it was necessary. But since muscular dystrophy causes your muscles to get weaker and break down over time, the chromosome disorder would break down the rest of Gypsy's entire bodily functions. So these two things together were kind of what Dee Dee used as stepping stones to get to other diagnoses for Gypsy. Because when Dee Dee would take Gypsy to the doctor for any new diagnosis or any new symptoms of whatever outlandish medical condition that she was talking about this time, the doctors would always run whatever tests were necessary on Gypsy in order to rule out whatever it was that Dee Dee had brought her in for. And when those tests would come back as completely normal, Dee Dee would not argue with them. She would just switch Gypsy's doctor to another office or a different hospital and try again. And she would switch doctors as many times as she needed to until she found a doctor that would diagnose Gypsy with whatever she had taken her in for. But sometimes Dee Dee didn't even have to convince these medical professionals of anything because remember, she's a nurse's aide. So she did have some kind of medical background and knowledge, and some of these doctors just kind of took her at her word. She knew all the right terminology and she knew exactly what she should say, but if they didn't believe Dee Dee, then that was never a problem either because she would just doctor shop until she found one that did, which is insane to me. So Dee Dee did have at least some kind of medical background and knowledge, and she was able to describe all of Gypsy's symptoms for whatever diagnosis that she was trying to get perfectly. So you would think if a kid comes in with every symptom for, I'm just going to use disease X as an example here. So this kid comes in with every single symptom for disease X, and her mom has a medical background, the chances are that's probably exactly what this kid has. And sadly, that's how all of this happened. So let's keep going. When Gypsy was somewhere around the age of 5 or so, she would become wheelchair bound for the most part and made to use a walker when she would walk, when she was allowed to walk anyways. There was actually a picture of Gypsy that I found when she was like maybe 4 to 6 years old, and she's in like a dance class or a room with a bunch of other girls that are all standing up and like you can tell they're like moving around, and Gypsy's just like chilling on the floor because she thought she could not walk. I also saw an interview that Dr. Field did with Gypsy, and she said that she was made to use a walker and a wheelchair sometimes, but that when Gypsy was around 8, she had a minor accident with one of her grandparents on like a motorcycle or maybe a dirt bike or something like that, and that accident was when Dee Dee started making Gypsy use a wheelchair all the time, no exceptions. She was never allowed to walk on her own, not even with a walker or with somebody like assisting her. And Gypsy even kind of made it seem like her injury from the accident was more like a pretty bad scraped up knee than anything else. Like it wasn't even really that major. But this was just a good enough excuse for Dee Dee to keep Gypsy in a wheelchair for good from this point on. Gypsy never went to public school, and she was always homeschooled by Dee Dee, even though Gypsy later says that she was never taught to read by Dee Dee, and that she taught herself to read by using Harry Potter books. I don't know how much I believe that, but I just don't see you teaching yourself to read with Harry Potter books, but whatever. So Gypsy's dad, Rod, was never very present in Gypsy's life. They weren't exactly estranged, but they also weren't super close either, and he wasn't around for a lot of this. Granted, he was only 17 when Gypsy was born, but I know moms who had babies at 14 and they're great moms and they're always present, so that's not me giving him an out. But Rod does also say that Dee Dee never really let him be around Gypsy, that she kind of kept Gypsy from him for the most part. Still not an out for him whatsoever, that's just me making an observation. And the more we learn about Dee Dee as we go forward, I could absolutely see her making Rod's life a living hell if he decided to fight her on seeing more of Gypsy. I also saw that Rod said that he had a family member approach him and tell him that they had saw Gypsy walking after Dee Dee had already told everybody that she couldn't walk. And this family member said that Gypsy looked like she was perfectly capable of walking on her own. So when Rod approached Dee Dee and asked her about it, Dee Dee just told him that yes, Gypsy could walk, but that it was extremely painful for her to walk and that it would make her muscles deteriorate faster or some shit like that. And of course, Rod believed her because she's the one going to all the hospital visits and, doctor visits with Gypsy. And even though Dee Dee tried to keep Rod away from Gypsy as much as possible, Rod still paid her $1,200 a month in child support. And I don't know if this was through the court systems or not, but I do know that he paid it religiously, and he even paid it after Gypsy turned 18. Rod still paid the $1,200 a month to Dee Dee even after she was 18, just because he knew that with all of Gypsy's medical conditions and ailments that it would make it nearly impossible for Gypsy to ever live on her own. As Gypsy grew up and more diagnoses were made, Rod would always compliment Dee Dee on how good of a mom she was and how devoted she was to Gypsy and her health. We like Rod. But again, with all of the multiple things that were wrong with Gypsy, all these things were found in different stages of her life. And when Rod would ask Dee Dee about how Gypsy could have so many different things wrong with her, Dee Dee would always take the time to educate him on the chromosomal disorder that Gypsy had, and she would explain that that chromosomal disorder that Gypsy did have was also the leading cause of a lot of the other medical diagnoses and illnesses that Gypsy suffered from. And again, when Gypsy was around 8 years old or so, Dee Dee told her that she had been diagnosed with leukemia. There was also a feeding tube placed on Gypsy around the same time. Dee Dee explained to Gypsy that her hair was going to start falling out in chunks from the treatments, that they should probably go ahead and shave it to keep it all the same length so that it didn't look choppy and, whatever. So Dee Dee's idea is to go ahead and get ahead of it and just shave Gypsy's hair instead of letting it fall out on its own. Just shave it completely bald and be done with it. So if you haven't put it together by now, Dee Dee herself was actually suffering from a severe case of Munchausen Syndrome By Proxy. So Gypsy doesn't actually have any of these medical conditions or illnesses or disorders. All these different things that she had been diagnosed with did not exist. For anybody who's unfamiliar with Munchausen Syndrome By Proxy, it's basically when a caregiver or parent either causes or exaggerates or fabricates illnesses in whoever it is that they're taking care of. And they do this in order to gain sympathy or money or attention. And in Dee Dee's case, she caused and fabricated all of these illnesses, disorders, diagnoses, and syndromes to gain all three: money, sympathy, and attention. Doctors and medical professionals still are not sure what causes people to suffer from Munchausen by proxy, but they do believe that most of the time it's heavily related to the abuser's childhood and past trauma. The abuser is almost always a woman, and 9 times out of 10, it's the mother abusing their own child. Some more characteristics of someone suffering by Munchausen by proxy is that they almost always have a medical background of some kind. And there are 2 different forms of Munchausen syndrome. One is more commonly seen, and it's where the abuser just claims that their child has all these different illnesses and sicknesses and disorders. The second one is less common, but it's what Dee Dee was doing, where the abuser, and again, usually the parent, actually causes their child to be sick. For example, there have been cases where parents inject salt into their kids just for the sympathy and attention. And though Dee Dee wasn't doing the salt thing, she was doing a lot of other things. And I feel like the way I said that they were injecting salt into their kids made it sound like it's no big deal. It's actually deadly. It just sounded weird when I said it. So a part of me wonders if people that suffer from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, if they do it for like the hero complex of it all. Like making their child sick in order to nurse them back to health and then be the superhero when it's all said and done. But another part of me wonders if they make their kids sick on purpose so that they can ensure that they'll always be needed by somebody. Kids grow up, and once they do, they don't need you to cut their food up anymore. And then eventually they don't need you to kiss their boo-boos and scare the boogeyman away. And after that, they don't need you to drive them around because they got a driver's license. Then they don't need you to buy their groceries or pay their bills because they moved out and got a job. But if your kid's always sick and they always need you, then maybe they'll never leave. I don't know. I'm nowhere close to a medical professional, and this is just me thinking out loud. And Dee Dee made Gypsy suffer through all sorts of surgeries and procedures, like the time that she said that Gypsy drooled too much, so the doctor sent Gypsy in to have surgery to remove some of her salivary glands. And things like this would just keep happening. But when Gypsy had to have some of her salivary glands removed, she claimed that Dee Dee used a numbing medicine in her mouth before the doctor's visits so that she would actually be drooling everywhere when they got in to see the doctor. So I'm sure that's why they went ahead with that surgery. But it almost seems to me like Gypsy is Dee Dee's paycheck. With Gypsy having so many diseases and medical ailments, the two would get free trips to Disney through the Make-A-Wish Foundation. They did tons of stuff through the Ronald McDonald Foundation. They got tickets to shows and concerts, like the time that they got VIP backstage passes to see a Miranda Lambert concert. I also want to say that I saw somewhere that Miranda Lambert even donated money to Dee Dee and Gypsy too, but if I did read that, it's been a while, so don't hold me on that one. And as far as how Dee Dee paid their bills, well, she paid their bills with Gypsy's disability check and also with the tons of donations from different organizations, churches, things like that. So now Dee Dee has Gypsy on medication for epilepsy, medication for muscular dystrophy, medications for asthma, and even though Gypsy had never actually been diagnosed with leukemia, Dee Dee would always tell people that Gypsy had leukemia. And I'm almost positive that those aren't even close to the only meds that Gypsy was taking. And I'm not sure that those are all the diagnosis, diseases, or whatever that Gypsy believed that she had. Those are just a few things that I wanted to mention and point out the fact that since Gypsy had never actually needed any of these medications and that she had already had some of her salivary glands removed, these meds were actually starting to rot her teeth away. Between the meds and having her salivary glands removed, it was bad. So now she's losing teeth left and right. And some of the medications that Dee Dee was making Gypsy take have side effects that actually mimic the disease or ailment that they're used to treat. So even if she didn't have those symptoms before, the side effects from the meds that she didn't need, she had the symptoms now for sure. Which was exactly what Dee Dee wanted, because now if Gypsy didn't look sickly enough for Dee Dee before this, then she most definitely would have looked it after taking all these different medicines that have all these different side effects that are basically the same as the list of symptoms that the actual disease or illness would have caused if Gypsy would have actually had anything wrong with her. And it wasn't just the medications and fake diagnoses. It was surgeries, procedures, and Gypsy was even put on a feeding tube. She was fed her daily nutritional calories through a liquid that was then ran through her feeding tube that entered her body. But as I looked into feeding tubes with Munchausen by proxy, I found that a feeding tube is basically a must-have for anybody suffering from Munchausen by proxy. Because with the feeding tube, they can put anything in that tube. Even when the person that's being abused is asleep, they're still able to put whatever they want into the feeding tube. So then they lose the risk of the kid that's being abused saying something to the doctors like, "Oh, Mom made me take this gross medicine yesterday and my stomach's been hurting ever since." So a feeding tube is a person with Munchausen by proxy's best friend. They can do anything and like the kid that's being abused would have no idea. So it was in 2005 when Dee Dee and Gypsy, they were still living in Louisiana at the time, but Hurricane Katrina came through and Gypsy was about 14 years old at this time. Of course, she didn't know that, but besides the point. When Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, it just demolished everything in its path. It was awful. People lost their homes, their lives, and it took a whole lot of years for Louisiana to get back anywhere close to what it had been before Katrina hit. Dee Dee and Gypsy were one of the families that lost their homes due to the hurricane. And with the long list of things that are supposedly wrong with Gypsy, of course, Habitat for Humanity swooped in because they're awesome, and they built Dee Dee and Gypsy a very pink, very customized, wheelchair-accessible house in Missouri. Dee Dee and Gypsy wouldn't even have to drive from Louisiana to Missouri because they were airlifted instead, which had to be hella expensive, but Dee Dee wasn't going to have to pay for it. You know, taxpayers, thank you. So she's using, taxpayers' money that she doesn't really need. And I think Dee Dee probably leaned more towards Missouri than staying in Louisiana just because a lot of the stuff had been destroyed in the hurricane, and Gypsy would still have to have her unnecessary medical treatments from somewhere. So Gypsy and Dee Dee lived in a rental while their new customized house was being built. They moved from Louisiana to Missouri in 2005 and then into their customized pretty pink house somewhere between 2007 and 2008. So at this point, Gypsy's 17, maybe 18, and people still believe her age is 10 to 12. And even Gypsy has no idea of her real age. Even at 17 and 18 years old, Dee Dee still made Gypsy play with Barbie dolls. She still made her dress up like all of her favorite Disney princesses because Gypsy loved Disney, which most 7 and 8-year-old girls do. And this is the thing with Dee Dee pretending that Gypsy was way younger than she actually was. It worked because they moved around so much and switched doctors so often that nobody would really realize that Gypsy wasn't aging because they were never in one place for too long. So Hurricane Katrina wasn't a good thing for anybody else except for Dee Dee, because now the house that had been ruined by the hurricane had been replaced with a prettier, nicer house, and also because Dee Dee was now able to say that all of Gypsy's previous medical records from Louisiana were either ruined and or lost in the hurricane. And according to allthingsinteresting.com, Dee Dee also added the letter E to their last name Blanchard in order to start over from scratch and to hopefully throw people off. But when asked about it, Dee Dee said that she added the E in hopes that her abusive ex-husband wouldn't find them. But with the hurricane, Dee Dee could use that excuse to tell new doctors in Missouri that Gypsy had literally anything she wanted, because there was not a whole lot of ways for them to check her medical records, and almost no way for the new doctors in Missouri to be able to back up or dismiss any of the claims that Dee Dee was saying. Or at least that's how Dee Dee thought it was going to work. But there was finally one doctor who caught on to Dee Dee and her mounds of bullshit. And it was a pediatrician neurologist named Dr. Bernardo Flasterstein. And he called bullshit so fast on Gypsy having muscular dystrophy. Gypsy's muscle mass seemed fine. And if she did have muscular dystrophy, then her muscle mass would have been nowhere close to as good as it actually was. So then he orders blood work on Gypsy and the labs come back and still everything looks fine. So he even goes so far as to have an MRI ordered on Gypsy just to check for himself, but the results for the MRI came back just fine also. Gypsy was fine, or at least he knew that she wasn't suffering from muscular dystrophy at the very least. So he asked Dee Dee for Gypsy's medical records from when they lived in Louisiana, because at this point, Dr. Flasterstein is suspecting Dee Dee of having Munchausen Syndrome By Proxy. So Dee Dee gives him the whole spiel about Gypsy's previous medical records either being destroyed or lost in Hurricane Katrina. And after Dee Dee and Gypsy leave from this appointment, Dr. Flasterstein was like, I was born at night, but not last night. So he starts calling around and digging a little deeper into other doctors that had seen Gypsy in her past when they did still live in Louisiana. And that's when he was told that all of Gypsy's other MRIs, blood work, and muscle mass had been fine also. So this would mean that Dee Dee would have also been fully aware of that. And Dr. Flasterstein later said that he did think about calling Child Protective Services and reporting his suspicions of Dee Dee making up different diseases and sicknesses that Gypsy had, but that he ultimately decided against it. He said he didn't really think anybody would believe him, especially since Dee Dee had everybody else convinced that Gypsy not only had muscular dystrophy, but all the other things that I've listed. And after that visit with Dr. Flasterstein, where he questioned Dee Dee about Gypsy's diagnosis, he never saw Gypsy again after that day, even though there was a follow-up appointment scheduled for 6 months later. But my thing is, doctors and teachers and first responders are mandated reporters, which means that they legally by law that they've taken an oath to report even just suspected abuse. He should have just made the damn call. I also found a picture of Dr. Flasterstein's medical notes that he had, made from that appointment with Dee Dee and Gypsy, and it said, quote, "Analyzing all of the facts, and after talking to her previous pediatrician, there is a strong possibility of Munchausen by proxy, which may be some underlying etiology to explain for her symptoms. A day after her visit, the mother called to report that Gypsy Rose mentioned arm numbness and back pain. As previously mentioned, she was referred to have an EMG, and we will proceed accordingly. I will update you with results. She is scheduled for a follow-up visit in my office in 6 months." And this note was dated to be on November 16th of 2007. Dr. Flasterstein does say that reporting a parent to Child Protective Services is common for parents who are neglecting their children. But in Gypsy's case, Dee Dee was over-treating her. There's a big difference, and I'm not real sure what they would have been able to do, even if he would have called and reported his suspected Munchausen by proxy with Dee Dee. So Gypsy was a teenager now, and she finally figured out that she could actually walk. But that was the only thing that she thought that her mom had lied to her about. Gypsy may have known that she could walk, but she didn't know that all those medical conditions were completely made up by her mom. So you gotta be wondering why Gypsy didn't say anything to any of these doctors. And this story of the time that Gypsy tried running away is exactly why Gypsy didn't say a word about her mom's constant abuse, and why Gypsy didn't say anything about knowing full well that she could walk. Because in February of 2011, Gypsy had started making online accounts that her mom didn't know about. Because all of Gypsy's other online accounts or social media accounts were all accounts that she shared with her mom, Dee Dee, like they were all joint accounts. And while Gypsy was browsing on one of her online accounts that her mom didn't know about, she met somebody that she liked. Now, Gypsy was actually 19 in 2011 when she met this 35-year-old man online, but she thought that she was only 15. Dee Dee had always lied to Gypsy and everybody else about her real age. Even Gypsy's own dad, Rod, called to wish her a happy 18th birthday, and Dee Dee told Rod not to tell Gypsy how old she actually was because she, quote-unquote, wouldn't understand, and that it would make her upset that she couldn't do all the things that other 18-year-old girls could do. So for literal decades, Gypsy had no earthly idea how old she actually was. All right, so back to where we were. Gypsy meets this guy online and she likes him, so she tries to run away with him to get away from her mom. But when Dee Dee realizes that she doesn't know where Gypsy was, of course, Dee Dee called the police and there was a manhunt for a mentally disabled, severely chronically ill 15-year-old girl ensued everywhere. This man had taken Gypsy to a hotel room and Dee Dee showed up with paperwork stating that Gypsy was a minor and that she was mentally unable to care for herself and that he was committing kidnapping by keeping her there. So now both Gypsy and this man, neither one have any idea that Gypsy wasn't actually 15. They don't know that she's 19 years old instead. And the police that were looking for Gypsy also had no idea of her real age either. Dee Dee had changed Gypsy's birthday so many times that nobody besides her mom and dad knew her real birthday or knew how old she actually was. And Gypsy's dad wasn't around for most of this. And I'm not sure how, but somehow Dee Dee had multiple birth certificates for Gypsy, and they all had different dates and years listed on each one. When Dee Dee finally got Gypsy back home after she had ran away with this man that she'd met online, they get home and there's nobody else around. Dee Dee took a hammer and smashed all of Gypsy's electronics. Phone, iPad, laptop, everything. But that's not all she did, though. Dee Dee also told Gypsy that if she ever tried to do that again, that she would smash her fingers with that hammer. Dee Dee didn't stop there, though. She not only smashed all of Gypsy's electronics and threatened to smash her fingers if she ever tried to escape again, but she also chained Gypsy to her bed with a dog leash and handcuffs. Dee Dee also installed bells over the tops of all of the doors in the house so that she would know when doors were opened by Gypsy. And that would be the first and only time that Gypsy ever tried to run away from home while Dee Dee was still alive and able to stop her. There seems to be a running theme in this case, and it seems to be that shit just never stops. Gypsy also claims that Dee Dee hit her with metal clothes hangers at one point during an argument they were having. And if you go look on Google at pictures of Dee Dee and Gypsy together, or if you just watch any of the old videos of the two of them together being interviewed or on stage when Gypsy's getting awards or, whatever, you'll notice that Dee Dee always has her hands on Gypsy. Whether she's holding Gypsy's hand to look like a supportive and caring mom, or whether she's holding her shoulders. Either way, Dee Dee is literally always touching Gypsy, and there's a reason for this. Dee Dee would force Gypsy to act, speak, and pretend to be a lot younger than she actually was, and Dee Dee did this on purpose. So when they were around other people, Gypsy was told to play with her Barbie dolls or her stuffed animals and to stay quiet. When they were being interviewed by somebody, or if doctors were asking questions and Gypsy would answer, if she did say something that Dee Dee thought was too mature for her age, or if Gypsy said something that she wasn't supposed to say, then Dee Dee would just give Gypsy's hand or shoulder a really tight squeeze. And from just one squeeze of her hand or her shoulder, Gypsy knew that that was her sign to either stop whatever it was she was doing, or to quit talking altogether. So now Gypsy's slowly starting to realize that her mom's lying to her about a lot of things. When Gypsy figured out that she could walk, that's when her rebellious phase started. Gypsy started sneaking onto the computer after Dee Dee went to sleep at night, and she set up an online dating profile on a Christian dating site, which would definitely not be okay with Dee Dee. This online Christian dating site is where Gypsy would meet Nicholas Godejohn. Nicholas Godejohn would be the man who would inevitably kill Dee Dee at Gypsy's request. The more Nicholas and Gypsy talked, the closer they got, and they eventually got extremely close with each other. Nicholas introduced Gypsy to things like sex-related, and eventually the two were participating in online video calls, and they would do this every chance that Gypsy got. Nicholas taught Gypsy all about, like, BDSM stuff, which stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadomasochism and masochism. And during these online video calls, they would kind of act out these different BDSM acts with each other. And when they would do this, this is what Nicholas referred to as his quote-unquote evil side. And Gypsy started to trust him, which I guess normally when you're doing sexual things with somebody, you do trust them. Gypsy actually trusted Nicholas so much that she told him that she could walk, that her mom just wouldn't let her walk. She told him how she suspected her mom was lying to her about a lot of other things in regards to her health, and Nicholas told Gypsy about his multiple personalities. It was just true love. One of Nicholas's multiple personalities was supposedly a 500-year-old vampire, and I want to say it was like, his name was like Nikolai or something like that. Nicholas ended up giving Gypsy different nicknames to go along with all of his different personalities. So, for all of Nicholas's personalities, Gypsy also had an alternate personality to match his. So, Gypsy finally gets this idea, and she's like, oh, maybe if Dee Dee meets Nicholas in person, that she would like him just as much as Gypsy liked him, and that she would kind of approve of them being together. So, the plot thickens a little bit here. Dee Dee and Gypsy had plans to go see the new live-action Cinderella movie, and Gypsy asked Nicholas to meet her and Dee Dee at the theater. And Nicholas and Gypsy would plan on just like accidentally and magically bumping into each other, and then bam, Dee Dee would approve and they'd be able to live happily ever after together. This would be their first face-to-face meeting at the movies, and this happened sometime in 2012. But, of course, Gypsy's plan didn't exactly go how she wanted it to. When Dee Dee and Gypsy sit down to watch the movie, Nicholas had kind of sat close by Gypsy and he asked if she wanted to sit with him. Dee Dee thought that Nicholas was super creepy because he was a grown man at a Cinderella movie all by himself. Meanwhile, Gypsy is in her mid-20s during this time, dressed as Cinderella, wig, gown, you name it, and Dee Dee is still pretending that Gypsy's like 11 or 12 years old. So how is it weird that Gypsy's there being treated like a literal child, but it's weird because Nicholas is there by himself? Come on now. Something ain't adding up, Dee Dee. So once Dee Dee realized that Gypsy was interested in Nicholas, like romantically, she just completely forbade Gypsy from ever seeing, speaking to, or mentioning Nicholas again. Because Dee Dee didn't know that Gypsy had actually been talking to Nicholas on the line, on the computer in secret, for a while before they had met up at the movie theaters. Also, side note, Gypsy had sent Nicholas money to buy a bus ticket to get to the theater because Nicholas lived in Wisconsin. Gypsy lives in Missouri. So, that was a wasted trip and a lot of money lost. So, Dee Dee doesn't know that they've been talking online, in secret. She just thought that Gypsy had ran into this guy at the movie theater and that she was just kind of having her first crush. And it's reported literally everywhere that while they were at the theater that somehow Gypsy was able to sneak away from Dee Dee's grasp long enough for her to go into the men's bathroom where Nicholas would be waiting for her for the two to have sex. So Gypsy's plan about Dee Dee meeting Nicholas and approving hadn't worked, not even close to worked. So Gypsy and Nicholas started working on what they would call their quote-unquote Plan B. But also, I have so many questions about this sex in the bathroom thing. How was Gypsy able to get away from Dee Dee's sight long enough to go into a public bathroom, into a men's bathroom at that, and then be in there long enough to have sex with somebody? Because even though Gypsy was an actual adult at the time, Dee Dee still very much treated her like an 8 or 9-year-old kid. I have a 10-year-old and 11-year-old boys, and I still make them go in the women's bathroom with me unless their dad's with me. Like, if my husband's not with me to go into the men's bathroom with them, they're not going in the men's. Unless, I'm lying. If it's a small bathroom, I will straight take my ass in and be like, hey, is anybody in here? And if somebody tries to walk in while my kids are in there, I'm like, yo, homeboy, you can wait a minute. I got 2 little ones in there. They'll be right out. My husband thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I am, but no, I don't trust people like that. All right, so another question I have about this is, like, did Dee Dee roll herself into the bathroom in her wheelchair that she didn't need? Or did she, like, roll herself out of the theater into the hallway where Dee Dee couldn't see anymore and then walk into the bathroom where Nicholas was? And how long were they in there having sex? Because I feel like it would have taken all of 4 minutes for Dee Dee to get up and go looking for Gypsy to check on her, Like, that doesn't really make sense. And like I said, it's reported everywhere that Gypsy and Nicholas had sex in the bathroom at the theater. I just can't seem to wrap my head around how they managed that. But whatever. We're going to move right along. So let's talk about Nicholas for a minute. Nicholas had a public indecency charge, and you're never going to guess what for. I'm going to tell you. Exposing himself inside of a McDonald's restaurant while watching porn for more than 8 hours. I'm sorry. What? I don't know how that McDonald's let that happen for that many hours before they called the police, but apparently they did. And all I'm going to say about that is they got some salty-ass fries. I mean, they're delicious. They're the best fries, but you would think that would burn. Okay, I'm done on that, I swear. But Gypsy thought she was in love with Nicholas, and she did not know about this charge at the time. And Nicholas said that his time with Gypsy was the best time of his life. So it seems like they both needed an escape, and they found it in each other. So Gypsy's at the point now where she just wants away from her mom, and she tells Nicholas this. And they talked about how to get Gypsy away from Dee Dee often over the next few years, because they did talk for years online, before and after this theater meetup. But Gypsy had tried to get away from Dee Dee before, and when she was caught and brought back home, she was chained to a bed and threatened with a hammer if she ever tried again. So naturally, the only way that Gypsy can think of to get away from Dee Dee is to have Nicholas kill her mom for her. And you know how people say, like, oh, I just love so-and-so, I would do anything for him. Well, Nicholas said that, and he meant it. The two came up with a plan, and they started putting the plan into motion. Quote-unquote, Plan B was for Nicholas to come to Gypsy's house in the middle of the night while Dee Dee would still be asleep. And he would just kill her. They would live happily ever after, and nobody would be the wiser. Because apparently they've never watched an episode of NCIS, Law & Order, Criminal Minds, or, hell, even Judge Judy. On June 9th, 2005, the plan was in full swing, and Gypsy left a pair of gloves outside for Nicholas when he got there. And again, Gypsy had sent Nicholas the money for the bus ticket to get there to Missouri from Wisconsin where he lived. So Gypsy texts Nicholas, and she says that she had left the gloves outside for him. You know, she didn't want his fingerprints on the doorknobs or whatever, so, I mean, they thought they were being smart. And she followed that up with a text about how she was painting her nails for him, and that they were really pretty and really pink. They're just really nonchalant about this entire murder thing. When Nicholas got to the house where Dee Dee and Gypsy lived, Gypsy let him inside. She gave him a knife, and Nicholas went into Dee Dee's bedroom where she was asleep. Gypsy says that she heard her mom yell like out of shock, and then she heard her mom yell out in pain. Gypsy wasn't in the room when Nicholas attacked Dee Dee. He had actually told Gypsy to get naked and to stay in the bathroom until he was done. So that's exactly what she did. And Gypsy said that she could hear Dee Dee like yelling for Gypsy, like yelling for her, until she just stopped making noise altogether. But before Dee Dee was dead, it's claimed that Nicholas really wanted to rape Dee Dee. And apparently he and Gypsy had talked about this before he killed her. So Gypsy was able to talk him into having sex with her instead of raping her mom. Like, dude really wanted to have sex, and he didn't care if it was before or after he murdered a woman. And I've never murdered anybody, but I would think that the dopamine release from murder would probably be enough of a high for most people, but not for him, I guess. So after Nicholas kills Dee Dee, Gypsy and Nicholas go into the next room over from Gypsy's dead mom, and the two have sex. But the part where Gypsy was actively trying to talk Nicholas out of raping her mom kind of says, like, something to me. It's almost like she really and honestly, truly believed that killing her mom was going to be the only way to get away from her. Because I feel like if she hated her mom and wanted to see her suffer, that she really wouldn't have cared if Nicholas would have raped her or not. I don't know, maybe my sympathy is too much in this case. I have done so much research. After Dee Dee was dead, and after Gypsy and Nicholas have sex, Gypsy packs her bags and she grabs a few $1,000s from her house. And the two head out of the house where they go get a hotel room together. And they spend the night in this hotel room. The next morning, Gypsy put the knife that Nicholas had used to kill Dee Dee with in the mail and mailed it to Nicholas's house in Wisconsin. So she had the wherewithal to think about the fact that it was probably a bad idea to travel more than 500 miles back to Nicholas's house with the same knife that they had just used to kill somebody with. After Gypsy and Nicholas left the hotel, they headed back to Nicholas's house where they hung out with his family. And they stayed there for a few days, but a few days after the murder is when a few posts started popping up on Facebook, and they were on the account that Dee Dee and Gypsy shared. One of the posts said, quote, "That bitch is dead." And when friends and neighbors saw this Facebook post, they were immediately worried. There was another post that was made on the shared Facebook account just a few minutes after the first one, and the second one said, quote, "I fucking slashed that fat pig and raped her sweet innocent daughter. Her scream was so fucking loud, LOL." So neighbors and friends are starting to see these Facebook posts and they're worried, but they're also wondering if somebody had just hacked Gypsy and Dee Dee's Facebook account. But nonetheless, they wanted to have somebody go out and make sure things were okay, just so they were all clear. And there was a call made to the sheriff's office on June 14th to have a welfare check done on Dee Dee and Gypsy at their house. Neighbors couldn't get them to come to the door. They weren't answering the phone. People were starting to get worried. This wasn't normal posts that you would see on their Facebook. And this wasn't how they spoke. So that was really throwing people off. And just so we're all on the same page, both of those Facebook posts were made by Gypsy, not by Nicholas. Police got on the scene at around 5 o'clock in the evening on the 14th of June. And there was no possible way for them to prepare for the bloody mess that they were about to walk into. Police found Dee Dee in her bed with her body covered by a blanket. Dee Dee's head had been almost completely severed, and she had been stabbed in the back multiple times. And as the police are looking around, they start to notice that there are all these wheelchairs and medical equipment, all these medications and medical papers are just laying around. And everybody's still under the impression that Gypsy couldn't do much of anything for herself. But Gypsy also wasn't in the house. Her wheelchairs were still there, her meds were still there, and police and neighbors immediately start thinking that Gypsy had been taken against her will. But luckily, police were able to track these Facebook posts that had been made on Dee Dee and Gypsy's shared account, and that sent them more than 500 miles away from where Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in Missouri, all the way to Wisconsin, which led police to a name. The name of a man that lived in the house where the Facebook post had been made was none other than Gypsy's longtime online boyfriend, Nicholas Godejohn. And they found Gypsy at Nicholas's house, perfectly healthy and walking around nonetheless. All of Gypsy's medications had been left at her house when she left with Nicholas after they killed Dee Dee, so police are kind of expecting her to be barely hanging on to life because she hadn't had her meds in days. But instead, they found Gypsy healthier than she'd ever been before and walking without assistance or a wheelchair. To say that people were shocked would be the understatement of the year. But you want to know who wasn't shocked? Dee Dee's family. Dee Dee's family literally flushed her ashes down the toilet after she was cremated. They all said that either Dee Dee had what had always been coming to her, or that they could see how Gypsy could be so done with being lied to and manipulated. They even kind of understood why Gypsy did what she did. Y'all, that's got to say something. But these people flushed Dee Dee's ashes down the toilet. They did not even want her around them in death. They asked everybody in the family if anybody wanted to keep her, and they all said no. This has to say something. This is wild. I have never heard anything like this in my entire life. Even family members that don't really care for each other don't do this. When they got the news that Dee Dee was dead, they legitimately said that their first thought was, "Oh Lord, who did Dee Dee piss off now?" Which is crazy. That would not be my first thought if I heard my family member was dead. So back to the investigation. It didn't really take long before the police got Gypsy and Nicholas in on murder charges and felony of armed criminal action charges. And armed criminal action is when the use of a weapon is used while committing any kind of crime. So both Nicholas and Gypsy were both found at Nicholas's parents' house within 24 hours of Dee Dee's body being found. So all this stuff's happening pretty quick. And the sheriff probably said his most infamous words that he would ever say in his entire career, when he did a press conference during the investigation stage of Dee Dee's murder, and he said, quote, "Things aren't always as they appear." And during this same press conference, he asked people in the community to stop donating money to the burial fund for Dee Dee and her funeral expenses, which, that's weird. They don't normally ask you to do stuff like that at a press conference for murder. Because by this point, the police had started piecing together the fact that Dee Dee had scammed hundreds of thousands of dollars out of taxpayers, and they started to realize that Dee Dee had kind of been playing the long con game, and that she was better at it than anybody else ever would be. And they bring Gypsy in for questioning, and at first she's like crying and playing dumb, like she has no idea why they even need to talk to her. But that act didn't last very long before Gypsy literally breaks down and tells her first version of the truth. And that's when Gypsy tells the officers questioning her that she's sorry that she had been lying to them and that she was ready to tell them the truth, and that Nicholas had killed her mom. But that he was only supposed to be coming to visit with Gypsy while Dee Dee was asleep, and they were supposed to hang out on the front porch, and that was all they were supposed to be doing. But that when Nicholas got there, he went inside and he walked through the house and he headed towards Dee Dee's room, and that's when Gypsy told him that they needed to go back outside. And that's when Nicholas locked Gypsy in the bathroom, and she started hearing her mom scream out for her and crying in pain. And Gypsy is like hysterically crying while she's telling them all of this. Also, all of that is a lie. But these police were pretty good at their job, and things weren't adding up with what they had found at the crime scene. They also found all of the communications between Gypsy and Nicholas going back to when they had first met a few years ago. The investigators also had access to all the texts that had been sent back and forth between Nicholas and Gypsy. Even though they had tried to delete a bunch of them, nothing is ever actually deleted anymore, so that doesn't work. And Gypsy and Nicholas were both just openly talking about killing Dee Dee through text messages. And eventually it was decided that neither Gypsy or Nicholas would face the death penalty. Eventually, Gypsy's lawyers were able to get a hold of her medical records, and the attorneys were able to strike up a plea deal for second-degree murder for Gypsy. She agrees to the plea deal, and this plea deal would keep Gypsy from going through a trial and letting a jury decide her fate. Gypsy took the plea deal for second-degree murder, where she would only serve 10 years in a Missouri prison. In 2024, Gypsy will be 32 years old, and she'll be eligible for parole. But in all reality, she could be out as early as December of this year in 2023. And during interviews that Gypsy's done while she's been incarcerated, she claims over and over again that she feels more free inside of a prison cell than she ever did while she lived with her mom. Which also says something to me. She feels more free inside of a prison than she ever did inside of a house where she lived with her own mother. You just never think you'd hear somebody say that. Now, Nicholas, on the other hand, did decide to go forward with a jury trial and take his chances. The trial lasted 4 days, and Gypsy testified during Nicholas's trial. And when she testified, she said that she had stolen the knife that was used to kill her mom from a Walmart, and that she gave it to Nicholas when he got to her house that night when he murdered her mom. Nicholas's defense attorneys didn't try to say that Nicholas was innocent, but they did try to claim that his autism made it impossible for him to actually comprehend his actions and the consequences of those actions. But Gypsy and Nicholas had texted over and over and over again about this plan to kill Dee Dee, with Gypsy replying to one text saying that she was, quote, 1,000% with the plan. The jury only took about 2 hours to come back with a guilty verdict for Nicholas on the count of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. And another 25-year sentence for the charge of felony armed criminal action, and both of those sentences are to run concurrently. Nicholas's attorneys did try to get him another trial, but that request was denied, but he is allowed to make appeals and, hopefully get his charges and sentences, changed, and he probably will. Nicholas's mom told investigators that the doctors that had diagnosed Nicholas with autism and Asperger's had also said that Nicholas would always have the mental capacity of like a 15 or 16-year-old, that he would never mentally get older than that. And I figured he would probably try to use this as a defense as he goes through with his appeal processes again, but we'll see. And Gypsy does later tell investigators that she posted those 2 Facebook statuses because she hadn't seen anything on the news about her mom's body being found, and that she was worried if Dee Dee wasn't found soon that she wouldn't be able to have a proper burial. So that's a little bit weird. Like, it's okay to plot and have your boyfriend kill your mom and actually go through with it, but at least make sure she can have a proper burial? I don't know, I don't get that. And people that were close with Dee Dee and Gypsy said that after the murder, that looking back on some things they saw, that they should have been red flags at the time, and that they somehow just managed to miss all the red flags. They did say that Dee Dee wouldn't let Gypsy be alone with anyone for any reason for any amount of time. And that even when the cameras weren't on, that Dee Dee would still always hold Gypsy's hand. And now they do believe this was like Dee Dee's way of silencing Gypsy for saying something or doing something that she didn't want her to do. Friends say that even when there was a group of people that were all hanging out together, that Gypsy wasn't allowed to hang out with or even be alone with other people. Even with people that were the same fake age as Gypsy. Neighbors of Dee Dee and Gypsy also believe that Gypsy's dad, Rod, was a raging drunk who left Dee Dee because he couldn't handle all of Gypsy's medical ailments. That he was super abusive, and all of that is the furthest thing from the truth. Rod and his new wife, Christy, had tried multiple different times to go to Missouri to visit with Gypsy, and Dee Dee would always say, like, heck yeah, we'd love to see y'all, y'all can stay with us, like, whatever. And then it would be like 24 to 48 hours before they were supposed to leave for their trip to visit with Dee Dee and Gypsy, that Dee Dee would call and tell them, like, oh, Gypsy's not feeling good, now she's just not up for visitors, we'll have to try again later. So now with Gypsy being in prison and she's finally out from under her mom's thumb, she's learned the truth about a lot of things that Dee Dee had lied to her about as far as her dad goes and her medical history goes. And Gypsy and her dad, Rod, are building a relationship with one another. And Rod and Gypsy's stepmom, Christy, are super supportive of Gypsy. And they're super excited for her to get out of prison so they can finally help her start her own life. And we do find out later, after the investigation was headed into trial, that there had been an anonymous call made in 2009 to the Springfield, Missouri Police Department for suspicions of neglect or child endangering, and that they knew that Dee Dee was using different birth dates for Gypsy, and they also had suspicions that Gypsy was likely not as sick as Dee Dee claimed she was. And we never actually find out who made this call, but when police got there to question Dee Dee, she gave them papers that she had drawn up that said that legally Gypsy was incompetent and that she would never be able to care for herself, and that's really all the police needed to leave and never come back. They never even did a follow-up visit to the house. So that was it. So honestly, after I've researched all of this, I just keep thinking, what was Gypsy actually supposed to do? Like, I know murder is not the answer, but the police couldn't help Gypsy. The doctors and social workers couldn't help Gypsy. Her dad couldn't help her. Friends couldn't help her because she didn't have any. She wasn't allowed. Teachers couldn't help her because she didn't go to school. Literally every single person who is supposed to be able to help couldn't help. I'm not saying murder's right, but I'm saying it's not hard for me to see how Gypsy got here. I've watched so many home videos and looked at so many pictures, and honest to God, it looks like Gypsy was conditioned and trained to act so much younger than she actually was. And even trained and conditioned to appear to have these medical problems. And I think the creepiest video that I watched was a video of Gypsy sitting on the railing of their front porch at their house, and she's in a snowsuit, and she says, like, "This is Gypsy Rose reporting live from Missouri," and she's telling the camera that she's about to attempt to jump into this pile of snow, and so she kind of scoots her butt off, but when she lands on her feet and then just kind of collapses. And then she, scoots her butt around to move using her arms, and then she uses her arms to pick her legs up to move her legs. But she could walk. This whole time, she could walk. It is so fucking weird, especially knowing that she knew she could walk. It's not like she had never tried and she just took her mom's word for it. She always walked around in secret after Dee Dee would go to bed. But yet she's still picking her legs up with her hands to move them. I mean, I don't know. It's like brainwashing, or I don't know. I'm going to try to find that video and post it, because once you see it and once you know that she can walk, it's so much more creepy. Like, could you imagine being able to walk completely fine and not being allowed to use your legs and to have to ride around in a wheelchair all day long, every single day with no exceptions? Like, I could not imagine that. Even now at Gypsy's age, her voice is still super squeaky, and she still sounds like she's never been through puberty, which I'm not sure that she has with all the meds she was on. That probably stopped that somehow. I'm also not a doctor. That may not even be a thing. Don't come at me. And she still seems super immature for her age, almost like she's just now learning how to act like an adult in her 30s. So I don't know. And I know I mentioned earlier that Gypsy had a feeding tube put in when she was super young, but those feeding tubes aren't something you just have, like, put in once and it's a done deal. Those have to be changed every few months or so, and they don't put you to sleep to change it, and it's super painful. And remember Dr. Flasterstein from earlier, who called Dee Dee out on her bullshit? Well, after Dee Dee was murdered, the attorneys and Gypsy's dad Rod and her stepmom Christy were all going through Gypsy's medical records. And they found that Dee Dee would request Gypsy's medical records like every so often. And once she had gotten those medical records from the visit, she would have saw Dr. Flasterstein's note that said that he suspected Munchausen by proxy, which would explain why Dee Dee didn't take Gypsy back to that office for more than 8 years. Because Dee Dee would have known that Dr. Flasterstein was on to her. And something else that I hadn't thought about until I was watching an animated movie yesterday with my youngest son. And I started thinking, Dee Dee tried to keep Gypsy looking and acting so much younger than she was. And, like, she was always pushing her to dress in Disney characters, like dress up like princesses and, you know, just watch Disney movies all day. And Gypsy just, like, every time she talks, it's like, oh, everything's just a fairy tale. And I almost wonder if those Disney movies that Dee Dee made her watch over and over again didn't play some kind of role in Gypsy's choice to kill her. Like, in Disney movies, the bad guy always dies and the good guy always wins. And it's not like Gypsy had other friends her age that she could talk to about things that were bothering her or things that she wanted to get off her chest, because Dee Dee never let Gypsy out of her sight. She had no other outlet and no other relationship to base off of what was healthy. And Gypsy even says that one of her favorite Disney movies is the movie Tangled, where the princess is kept in a castle away from the rest of the world, and eventually the woman holding the princess captive dies and the princess is freed. Like, I don't know how much clearer it gets than that. So maybe Nicholas was just Gypsy's version of a Prince Charming. And even though they didn't actually get to live happily ever after, that he somehow did save her from her mom. He was somehow still her Prince Charming that saved her. Nicholas and Gypsy don't talk anymore, and Gypsy's actually been engaged to a pen pal named Ken, who she'd met while she was in prison. And the engagement fell through, but at 30 years old, Gypsy did get married to a different man named Ryan Scott Anderson. And he was 36 at the time that they got married, and Gypsy's wedding took place 6 years into her 10-year prison sentence. So she also met him as a pen pal. Hopefully they'll work out, and hopefully she'll get her happily ever after. Because even though I don't agree that she had somebody murder her mom, I do feel like everybody deserves some kind of normalcy, and she's just never had that. She's never had the chance to experience that. So hopefully when she gets out, either at the end of this year or sometime next year, like, hopefully she gets to live her best life. That's all I hope. And I think that is that on that for this week. So, before we sign off with the see you next week, if you like the show and you've been listening, leave me like a 5-star review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple, Audible, like wherever you listen. Just leave a rating. If you think I'm a 2-star, rate it that. Just like rate it what you think it deserves. And if you don't feel like doing that and you don't have 30 seconds, that's fine too. Just tell a friend about the show. You can find me on just about every platform at murdered_mama. And on Facebook, just search the group Momma Murdered A Podcast. And until then, let's do it again. same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.